The land had always been more than just soil and trees. It carried history in every corner. My grandfather had left it to me with a simple sentence written into his will. Asterisk, guard the dam, and it will guard you. Asterisk at first, I didn't quite understand what he meant. The property stretched over a wide valley, rolling hills sloping down toward a man-made reservoir he had engineered decades earlier. The dam itself wasn't grand or flashy, but it was sturdy, a solid wall of stone and steel that controlled the waters gathered from mountain streams above. To me, it was a quiet place, a reminder of family legacy rather than anything of real financial value. Most of the town had forgotten the land even existed. Developers talked about new neighborhoods and retail centers, but no one ever came to me with offers. It sat tucked away, outside the eyes of progress, and I was content with that. The reservoir provided peaceful mornings, the sound of trickling water a constant rhythm when I walked its banks. Some days, I thought my grandfather had left me nothing more than a burden of maintenance. Still, I kept the paperwork safe. The deed, yellowed with age, and the original engineering plans for the dam were locked away in my attic. The documents weren't just legal proof. They were a connection to the man who had built all this with his own hands. I visited the dam often, inspecting the gates, walking along its wall, listening to the pressure of the water behind it. It was powerful, quiet, and always waiting. I didn't know then how important it would become. What seemed like a simple inheritance, a forgotten valley with a dam and a stretch of open ground, was about to become the stage for a battle no one else saw coming. It started quietly, almost too quietly for me to notice at first. I would drive past the edge of my land and see surveyor stakes hammered into the ground, bright orange flags fluttering in the wind like little warnings. At first, I thought they were just marking utility lines or mapping out future county work. But then came the trucks, white pickups with logos I didn't recognize, and men in hard hats walking around as if they already owned the place. I approached them once, asking what they were doing, and one of them brushed me off saying, "We're working for the HOA. New housing project." That phrase stuck with me. What? New project? On my land? I laughed it off, thinking it had to be a mistake. Surely, someone somewhere had their boundaries mixed up. My deed was clear, my grandfather's name etched in black ink on county records, later transferred legally to me. But within weeks the laughter faded. Heavy machinery rolled in, bulldozers, graders, cement mixers. Trees came down, earth was flattened, and soon the outlines of roads began to form. I called the county office, but the clerk dismissed my concerns, saying all the permits were in order. That was the first time a wave of unease ran through me. Whose permits? Who signed off on building here? When I pressed further, I was told to take it up with the HOA board that had commissioned the project. The arrogance in their tone was impossible to ignore, as if I were the one intruding. The strangest part was how quickly it all moved. Houses seemed to rise overnight, framing against the sky where open meadows used to be. Neighbors congratulated the board on their expansion, while I stood there, watching strangers pour foundations into land I had walked since childhood. A storm was brewing, and they didn't even realize who held the floodgates. By the time the first row of houses was completed, the reality had sunk in. The HOA truly believed the land was theirs. They put up glossy signs at the entrance of the new development, calling it Riverstone Meadows, complete with flowers planted around the posts. Families began moving in, unloading U-Hauls and waving cheerfully at one another, as though they were pioneers settling untouched ground. Every smile I saw only deepened the knot in my chest. This wasn't untouched, it was mine. My grandfather's dam stood just a few hundred yards away, holding back the reservoir that made this valley livable. None of them seemed to know or care. I started digging deeper, combing through county records, plat maps, and zoning documents. Page after page confirmed what I already knew. My family's deed had never changed hands. Yet somehow, the HOA had secured approval to build as if the land was public domain, like it had been sitting there waiting for them. Either it was arrogance, corruption, or both. When I called the HOA president, she didn't even let me finish explaining. "Look, we've invested too much to stop now. If you think you own it, sue us." Her tone wasn't worried, it was smug. That smugness ignited something in me. I wasn't just protecting paper ownership anymore. I was defending legacy. Every brick they laid felt like a personal insult. And as I stood on the dam one evening, staring at the water glinting in the sunset, I realized the irony. They were building their perfect little neighborhood in the shadow of the very structure that could wipe it away in minutes. My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. Guard the dam, and it will guard you. The HOA thought they had power. They hadn't yet seen what real power looked like. The attic smelled of dust and cedar when I pulled down the old box that had been sitting untouched for years. Inside were the papers my grandfather had guarded with his life. The deed to the land, surveys marked with his careful handwriting, and the original blueprints of the dam he had overseen decades ago. The deed was yellowed but perfectly legible, stamped with the county seal, signed and notarized in a time when men didn't play games with property rights. Holding it in my hands felt like holding a sword in its sheath, quiet, but powerful enough to cut down any lie. I spent hours going through everything, page by page. There was no question. The land, the dam, the reservoir, every inch of soil the HOA had touched was mine. No transfer. No liens. No tax defaults. Clean ownership stretching back through 2 generations. I carefully slid each document into protective sleeves and placed them in a binder, a shield of truth I could bring anywhere. Still, I knew paperwork alone wasn't enough. I started documenting the HOA's every move. I photographed construction, recorded trucks pulling in, and saved every brochure advertising Riverstone Meadows as their proud new expansion. I clipped articles from the local paper where the HOA bragged about adding 35 new homes to the community footprint. Each item went into the binder beside the deed, creating a timeline of arrogance. What struck me most was how easily they had fooled everyone else. Realtors sold homes with a smile, families signed 30-year mortgages, and not one person asked whether the HOA even owned the dirt they were building on. That ignorance would cost them dearly. One night, I set the binder on my desk beside my grandfather's dam plans. 2 legacies side by side. One was paper. The other was water and steel. Together, they made me untouchable. It was only a matter of time before the HOA finally noticed me watching too closely. One afternoon, as I stood near the property line, a convoy of shiny SUVs rolled up. Out stepped the HOA president, flanked by 2 board members who looked as though they'd rehearsed their scowls in a mirror. She marched straight toward me, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking against the pavement like gunfire. "Excuse me," she snapped. "This is private property. You can't just stand around here." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Private property? I had walked this land since childhood. Yet here was a woman who had never set foot on it until recently, claiming authority she didn't possess. I kept my tone calm. "This land doesn't belong to you." Her lips curled into a smirk. "Actually, it does. The HOA approved this expansion years ago. If you keep trespassing, we'll fine you. And if you don't pay, we'll take legal action." Her board members nodded eagerly, like vultures circling a meal. I didn't argue. Instead, I let her words hang in the air, each thread a reminder of how arrogant they'd become. She mistook my silence for weakness, shaking her head and muttering something about troublemakers. When they finally left, I could still hear their laughter echoing down the street. What they didn't realize was that every encounter like this only sharpened my resolve. Each insult, each false claim, pushed me closer to the decision I already knew I would make. They thought I was a stubborn holdout refusing to bow to their authority. What I truly was, however, was the landowner holding the one card they could never outplay. The deed was mine. The dam was mine. And soon, they would understand what real trespassing meant. The decision wasn't made in a single moment of rage. It built slowly, like water pressing against the walls of the dam my grandfather had designed. Every time I saw another truck unload bricks, every time a realtor's sign went up advertising dream homes, the pressure grew. I could hear my grandfather's voice in memory, reminding me that the dam was both a gift and a weapon, capable of giving life or taking it away. He had built it to provide irrigation and protect the valley from floods. Now, decades later, it waited quietly, holding back a force that could sweep away arrogance in an instant. I spent long nights walking the dam, running my hands along its cold concrete, studying the spillways and gates. The mechanics were simple but powerful. With one turn of the wheel, Water that had been trapped for years would thunder down the channels, unstoppable. I imagined how quickly the low-lying construction site would vanish beneath it, how the manicured lawns and fresh paint would dissolve into chaos. The HOA thought they had conquered my land with contracts and smug threats, but water didn't care about paperwork. Still, I wasn't reckless. I mapped out the area, noting where the water would travel and how fast. I checked for escape routes, ensuring no one would be harmed. I didn't want lives destroyed, only lies. My goal was not vengeance for its own sake, but to remind them of nature's supremacy, and of the consequences of building on land that was never theirs. Standing atop the dam one evening, watching the reservoir glisten under the moonlight, I knew the time was near. The HOA had forced my hand. If they wouldn't respect my deed, they would respect the flood. The night before I acted, the entire neighborhood seemed to glow with celebration. Families gathered on their porches, kids rode bikes up and down the newly paved streets, and the HOA strung banners across lampposts proclaiming "Welcome to Riverstone Meadows." They had even planned a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the weekend, complete with speeches and catered food. The arrogance of it all was almost unbearable. They were celebrating on stolen ground, toasting to homes rooted in lies. I walked among them unnoticed, blending in with the crowd, every smile and cheer fueling the storm inside me. Back at home, I prepared carefully. I packed the binder with the deed, surveys, and every photo I'd taken, setting it by the door like armor. Then I pulled on my boots and jacket, not out of ceremony but practicality. The night would be long, and when it ended, nothing about Riverstone Meadows would look the same. The air was cool as I approached the dam, the sound of crickets loud against the silence of the reservoir. I paused halfway across the walkway, gazing down at the black water stretched out like a sleeping giant. My heart pounded, not from fear but from the weight of history. My grandfather had built this structure to serve the land, and now I was about to use it to reclaim it. At the control wheel, I hesitated only once. I thought of the families, innocent in their own way, but also complicit in their ignorance. They hadn't asked who owned this land. They hadn't questioned the HOA's authority. They had chosen comfort over truth. With a steady breath, I placed my hands on the cold metal and began to turn. The wheel groaned, the gates shuddered, and deep within the dam, the water stirred awake. The flood had begun. The sound came first, a low, guttural rumble that grew into a roar as the spillway gates opened wider. The stillness of the reservoir shattered into chaos, waves colliding and surging forward with a force no wall of concrete could disguise. I stood on the walkway above, watching as the first torrents thundered through the channels, white spray erupting like fireworks against the night. It was raw, untamed power, the kind that reminded man of his smallness. For a brief moment, I felt almost outside myself, as though I were watching history unfold rather than guiding it. Down in the valley, the transformation was immediate. The water raced downhill, carving through fields and unfinished lots before slamming into the edge of Riverstone Meadows. Lawns disappeared beneath a rising tide, fences buckled, and basements filled in seconds. Lights flickered and went out as transformers sparked, casting the neighborhood into a surreal darkness illuminated only by moonlight and the reflections of rushing water. I saw shadows moving, families stumbling out of their new homes in confusion, shouting, cars screeching as people tried to escape the flood. Their panic was loud, but the water was louder. The HOA, once so smug with their threats and rules, now scrambled helplessly, their clipboards and fines useless against the current. And yet, as destructive as it seemed, I had kept my calculations true. The flood consumed the houses and streets, but avoided the higher ground where escape routes lay. The people would survive. What would not survive was their illusion of ownership. From my perch on the dam, I could see the truth written in waves. The land was not theirs to claim. Nature had simply reminded them of it, and I had been the hand that opened the door. By dawn, the chaos had turned into a strange and eerie calm. The water had settled into a wide, shallow lake, swallowing the 35 houses whole. From a distance, the neighborhood looked like a mirage. Rooftops peeking above the surface, street signs barely visible, cars half submerged like forgotten toys. News vans had already arrived, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as reporters scrambled to capture the story. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras beaming the disaster to every living room in the county. I drove down quietly, binder on the passenger seat, and parked at the edge of the flood zone. People were gathered in clusters, soaked and shivering, their voices low and stunned. The HOA president was among them, her pristine suit ruined, mud streaked across her cheeks. She barked orders that no one listened to anymore, her authority drowned along with her expansion. When she spotted me, her expression twisted in fury. She stormed over, demanding answers, accusing me of sabotage, trespassing, even terrorism. I let her words wash over me like meaningless noise. Then, when the sheriff arrived with deputies in tow, I stepped forward. Calmly, I opened my binder, pulling out the deed and spreading the documents across the hood of a patrol car. The sheriff's brows furrowed as he read. He asked questions, checked signatures, traced seals. Piece by piece, I laid out the proof. The land surveys, the construction advertisements, the newspaper clippings. The crowd pressed closer, listening, their murmurs growing as the truth dawned on them. The sheriff finally turned to the HOA president, his tone flat but sharp. This land was never yours. You built illegally. She tried to protest, but her voice cracked under the weight of silence. For the first time, her clipboard and threats held no power. The land had spoken, and now so had the law. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with homeowners, reporters, and curious onlookers who had followed the flood story from the first breaking headline. The air buzzed with tension, the kind that comes before a verdict destined to change more than just one neighborhood. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my binder open in front of me like a shield. Across the aisle, the HOA's lawyers shuffled papers nervously, their once confident smirks long gone. Even the president, who had built her reputation on intimidation, looked small in her tailored suit, her eyes darting nervously around the room. When the judge called my name, I rose and stepped forward. Calmly, I presented the deed, holding it high enough for the gallery to see. The old document, stamped and notarized decades ago, carried more weight than all the HOA's glossy brochures and legal jargon combined. I laid out the timeline, the surveys, and the evidence of construction done without my consent. Each word landed like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples through the courtroom. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue, claiming miscommunication, technical oversights, and good faith development. But their words rang hollow. The judge leaned back in his chair, unimpressed, and finally delivered his ruling. The land was legally mine, and the HOA had no right to build upon it. Gasps filled the room as the gavel struck. The homeowners realized the truth. Every mortgage, every contract they had signed was worthless. They had bought houses on stolen land. The HOA president buried her face in her hands, her empire collapsing in a single sentence. I gathered my binder and stood tall. Justice had been served, not by revenge alone, but by truth and patience. The dam had washed away their arrogance, and the law had sealed their fate.